Today is the seventh session of our year with Bayard Rustin, and I'm going to speak about his work on economic justice. For much of the 60s and 70s, Rustin worked for A. Philip Randolph, a labor organizer who began as the head of the American Negro Labor Council and later the A. Philip Randolph Institute. Randolph reached out to Rustin to organize the 1963 March on Washington. Others were concerned that Rustin's known homosexuality would tarnish and hinder that effort. So Randolph agreed to head the effort, but made it clear from the start that he would immediately delegate all the responsibility to Rustin. And the coalition agreed to this cosmetic compromise. As Rustin envisioned this march, it was a bit different from what eventually occurred. The march was originally timed to mark the 100-year anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. As Rustin envisioned it, the march was about economics. He said, the 100 years since the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation have witnessed no fundamental government action to terminate the economic subordination of the American Negro. And that this was the great unresolved crisis of the national economy. His vision was that the march would be part of a bigger program, that the first day would be what he called a mass descent on the Capitol. He said they would, quote, so flood all the congressmen with a staggering series of labor, church, civil rights, and other delegations from their own states that they would be unable to conduct business on the floor of Congress. The next day would be a protest rally that would project our concrete Emancipation Proclamation to the nation and would hold the politicians accountable to respond to that call. Well, this massive direct political action did not sit well with the traditional civil rights organizations. They were concerned that it would disrupt the tenuous but positive political progress that had been made to the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. So eventually, both the scale and the focus of the march narrowed and shifted to a more, to a discussion that was already ongoing about eliminating discrimination in existing employment, rather than focusing on transforming the economy to eliminate unemployment. Now, despite the fact that it was narrowed and shifted from his original focus, Rustin was, of course, key to the success of this pivotal point in the civil rights movement. And you can read about his role in that in many places. I'm not going to cover that here. Because for Rustin, political demonstrations and even civil disobedience were not ends in themselves. They focused attention on issues so that momentum could be gained for concrete political proposals. So there was always a next step. And the next step after the March on Washington for Rustin and Randolph was the Freedom Budget. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were necessary. But now it was 1965 and they were passed. And in 1966, the focus had to shift to the economy. As Rustin noted in his original proposal for the march, quote, when a racial disparity in unemployment has been firmly established in the course of a century, the change over to, quote, equal opportunity, end quote, does not wipe out the cumulative handicaps of the Negro worker. He instead emphasized that the civil rights movement is evolving from a protest movement into a full-fledged social movement, an evolution calling its very name into question. It is not concerned anymore merely with removing the barriers to full opportunity, but with achieving the fact of equality. And the main tool that he was going to use for that was the Freedom Budget. The Freedom Budget was a program that was a 10-year plan to raise and stabilize the standard of living for all Americans who are living on the economic edge. The introduction to a pamphlet that explained this program had the following bold statement. Here in the United States, where there can be no economic or technical excuse for it, poverty is not only a private tragedy, but in a sense, a public crime. It is above all a challenge to our morality. The core of the Freedom Budget was its avowed purpose to eliminate poverty for all Americans. It's called the Freedom Budget for All Americans. It was not aimed any longer at just creating equal opportunities for Black folks. As he said, in an economy that was not thriving, it was just a chance, an opportunity to join a failing project, essentially. The keystone holding, but there was also an important recognition, and that was that piecemeal programs could never achieve this purpose. The keystone holding all the programs together was jobs. Creation of jobs to reach full employment and raise the workers' standards of living. The program was not just about access to existing jobs. As a matter of fact, he viewed that as a divisive idea. He viewed that white workers feared the entry of Black workers into the workforce in an economy where there weren't enough jobs for everyone. So the program was not just about access to existing jobs, but new jobs created by federal programs to provide health care, education, housing, and a healthy environment, all of which were necessary to provide economic stability. So it had the following pillars. One, housing, building thousands of new affordable housing units in the decaying inner cities and elsewhere, and providing construction and other urban development jobs. Second, what we would call environmental infrastructure, funding programs to guarantee clean water and clean air in urban, rural, and recreational areas, and to create jobs to do those tasks, permanent jobs, and new sources of electricity in cities. Yes, this sounds a whole lot like the modern Green Jobs Initiative that's just being talked about now. In addition, there was education as a pillar, funding construction of new schools, expanded schools, renovated schools, which would also provide construction jobs and thousands of new teaching positions. Healthcare for all, making basic healthcare affordable and accessible to all. funding construction of new hospitals and outpatient facilities, creation of thousands of new healthcare jobs for nurses, medical technicians, and other care personnel, and job training so that all could achieve those jobs. Now, legislation had been proposed from time to, and also, by the way, a minimum wage increase and a guaranteed income for those who were unable to work. So it had a lot of things that are just now being talked about again. And all of these separate programs had been proposed from time to time. But the statement of the Freedom Budget was that these were all related. They were not separate, and they could not be implemented in a piecemeal fashion if they were going to succeed. A new more technologically based economy needed a more educated workforce. So to have full employment, there needed to be an expanded educational platform in the public schools, along with technological job training. But education and job training doesn't make sense if there are no jobs. Indeed, it could be corrosive. And I'm going to paraphrase here, but not much. In a speech, Rustin stated that taking a group of 17-year-old young Black men and giving them job training and sending them back to the ghetto where there was no job was like lobbing Molotov cocktails at society. But he also realized that a decent wage is not an end in itself, but a means to improve life. And if there's no decent housing available that working people can afford, it's not going to improve their quality of life. Healthcare must be available to keep workers and their families healthy without worrying about an illness that could wipe it all out. And then coming full circle, gains in education are not, providing classrooms and teachers would not result in true gains in education if a steady income, affordable health care, and decent housing did not create stable homes for children to grow and study in. All of these moving parts would raise the money in the pockets of working Americans, who would consume more and raise the general GNP and the tax base. And so the same tax rates on this growing economy would fund the new expenditures with no change in the existing budget. So anything that was funded would not have money taken away from it for this new budget. And it's very important because this is going to come up in a minute as a problem. But it was kind of in my mind a trickle up theory instead of a trickle down theory of getting a healthy economy. So the Freedom Budget began with a surprising amount of momentum. It was covered well in the news and with enthusiasm by the press. It had the backing of organized labor. Its political strategy was not one of insider lobbying. It was envisioned as a true grassroots movement, because Rustin knew that a program this sweeping would need a long-term commitment of the American people as a whole, and that was the target. He created this pamphlet that was 22 pages. It was written in easy language, and it was sent not only to Congress people, but also to the press and to local political action groups. And the last page of this pamphlet was labeled, "What can you do?" And only a few of them had to do with direct lobbying of Congress. It said, first, the objectives outlined in the Freedom Budget for all Americans can only be achieved when all those who advocate its adaptation their adoption are registered voters. Carry on a voter registration campaign in your area and demand that candidates for office tell you where they stand on the freedom budget. Second, order copies of this summary for your members of your club, trade union, neighborhood association, fraternal and religious groups. Order copies of the expanded freedom budget for all Americans for your local public and school libraries. Keep several on hand for reference work. Hold meetings for the general public about the federal budget, the freedom budget. Set up small study groups to relate the demands of the freedom budget to the needs of your community. Write to the Randolph Institute if you need help in planning meetings, if you need a speaker, or if you would like a field secretary to come help you organize activities in behalf of the budget. Write to your congressmen and senators and let them know that you support the budget and ask them to introduce legislation. Contact your city and state officials to let them know how the needs of your community will be met and demand that they pressure Washington for its attainment. So it was all about a teaching in, gaining consensus from the bottom up. And yet, despite this vision and the momentum from the March on Washington and the success of the Civil Rights Act and the Freedom Budget, the Civil Rights Acts, the freedom budget failed utterly. So why couldn't Rustin bring this one home? There were probably many, many factors that scholars tend to look at two, and I have a third that I will posit. The first is the splintering of the Civil Rights Coalition that had driven the movement of the 50s and the early 60s. There was a new generation of young and more militant voices rising up. Watts had exploded into riots. The dedication to nonviolence as a tactic was crumbling. And ironically, as Rustin himself recognized, the success of the Civil Rights Act took away some of the glue holding the coalition together. He remarked that what had held the movement together more than anything else was Bull Connor. People could unite to push back against a visible foe and a specific set of laws, like the Jim Crow laws. But once those had been conquered, the unity started to dissipate. Rustin also criticized what he saw as a liberal focus on civil rights as what he called a moral issue. He worried that once Jim Crow laws were removed, that liberals would essentially declare victory and walk away without any of the necessary follow-up to create real equality. He likened it very specifically to the problem that we had witnessed with the abolitionists, who once slavery was abolished, as he said, disappeared into thin air without sustained support for any economic program for bringing the newly freed people into the economy. Well, there was a program advocated by Black folks, 40 acres and a mule, very practical, but that was not followed up and did not have a great deal of political support. He saw that the strength and alliances that had worked together were falling apart. And the organizations that had led that movement, like the NAACP and CORE, et cetera, had members who viewed the freedom budget and its emphasis on jobs as taking away too much focus from the general moral basis of the movement. And they also distrusted organized labor that, after all, had not always been a friend to Black people. Dr. King had already started talking about the Poor People's Campaign, and he endorsed and wrote an introduction to the freedom budget. But Rustin viewed the Poor People's Campaign as not focused enough, too vague, and not concrete. But the biggest blow seems to have been the rise of the movement against the Vietnam War. It is indeed ironic that this peace movement would create stresses that would break Rustin from almost all the ties he had in his former life in the pacifist world. The attention of white liberals specifically shifted as a generation of young white men became eligible for the draft. Why was this a problem for the freedom budget? Because for those who wanted the single focus of left-leaning America to be on ending this war, the freedom budget was at best a distraction from the anti-war effort, and at worst, a betrayal. You can recall that the freedom budget did not require a change in spending on existing projects, and that included the defense budget. It explicitly stated that the existing budget did not change the level of defense spending, although it stated it didn't endorse it or reject it. It refused to take a guns or butter dichotomy approach. And for this reason, it was actively, frequently, and loudly denounced by many on the left as a war budget. But for me, the reason that Rustin's strategy didn't work was because of what is his greatest strength here became his greatest weakness. His refusal to split his testimony into testimonies. He did not see a peace testimony that supported peace without equality, peace without integrity, peace without community, without freedom. He said it actually challenged his view on pacifism. And this was also challenged a bit by the fact that well, it's ironic that he was often viewed as a foil to the rising young militant voices in American Black Power movement that was emerging. He was actually an early mentor of Stokely Carmichael, and although he didn't agree with the rhetoric and some of the tactics, he had a great sympathy and empathy for the anger and the real pain that was being expressed by these new young leaders. And he was beginning to therefore reevaluate his pacifism in 1965 and 1966. He said, "Whereas I used to believe that pacifism had a political value, I no longer believe that. I do not believe that you can organize a society in which men will refuse to fight unless they have a proven alternative to war. Therefore, I am a pacifist to this extent. I believe that the first and most important issue that we can do is to discover a means of defending freedom that men can use. It is ridiculous, in my view, to talk only about peace." Central to Rustin's thinking on this was the idea that freedom was, quote, "more valuable to people than peace," end quote. And his political project, therefore, became, quote, "to find a peaceful way to defend democratic freedom." He specifically was frustrated by the peace movement's efforts to end this war as opposed to end war. And this rhetoric did not endear him to his traditional ties in the pacifist movement. One of his oldest and dearest friends calling out to him, "How can you live with yourself?" So the pacifists also viewed him as selling out to organized labor and to the more conservative end of the Democratic Party. So he had a problem from his civil rights background because of rhetoric like this, and also because he wanted to shift the focus to a broader social program and not just benefits for Black Americans. And that really put him outside of both the peace and the civil rights movements. The failure of the freedom budget, therefore, pretty much ended his active domestic political life. He spent a lot of the last portion of his life with a much greater focus on international development issues, and then later on emerging gay rights issues. But it strikes me that his focus, his clear spotlight on economic problems, what we would now call structural problems, as opposed to discrimination, which was viewed primarily as a moral, ethical problem at the time, is very similar to the discussion which we are having now about the switch from a focus on racism to institutional racism. And so I think that there's a lot in this period that in which he was ahead of his time. And that was unfortunate because it did put him outside the mainstream. And I worry that that was part of the reason why he lost his anchor, and some of the things that I have most difficulty with in this period, including his unwillingness to directly and in an institutional way separate himself from the Johnson administration, but also his support for his very vocal and organized support for increasing military aid and specifically selling weapons and fighter jets to Israel, which just seemed to be very far outside of his previous view about pacifism. I sometimes feel that he drifted off because he no longer had the anchor of his other pacifist friends to discuss these issues with, but that's my personal view. So now we're going to turn to the queries.